to introduce you all to such a prominent, queer, gay cultural critic, in my opinion. And that's what matters here. Uh, he is an arts critic, cultural journalist, and essayist with a specialty in photography. His book that so many in the queer art world know him by is The Homoerotic Photograph. He told me how to pronounce these French photographers, so I'll try my best. Male images from Rue Delacroix to Maplethorpe. Maybe it's Delacroix to Maplethorpe, originally published by Columbia University Press in 1992, was reissued in a 2012 paperback edition. And he's currently under contract. Actually, I think this already came out, right,
Yes.
Alan?
Yes,
Okay.
it's out.
So what is recently out is by Oxford University Press, his biography of the 20th century American gay cosmopolitan photographer, George Platt Lynes. He's published in so many journals and magazines, including The Village Voice, American Photographer. He's written for Tablet, film reviews for The Forward. Um, a few works of his short fiction have been published, including a chapter from his novel, The French Professor, in the online Lodestar Quarterly. Yes, so there's so much that Alan is a part of, and I'm so happy that you're here to talk all about fellow travelers. So, welcome to the show, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So, I think first, I'm just curious about, even before we talk about fellow travelers, like, even what was your interest in becoming a gay cultural critic? Like, does this go back from, your writing studies? Like, what's the whole journey here, Alan?
Well, I was an art student originally, and I always thought that I actually wanted to be a writer.
Mm.
So the first published writing I did was art criticism for Art in America, well, for Arts Magazine and then Art in America. And little by little, my own personal interests evolved into photography. Um, and partly that was because in the period in which I was beginning to write and publish, uh, more and more gay photographers were obviously dealing with gay subject matter of one sort or the other, particularly homoerotic imagery. So that led me to my first book, which was a very long journey, I assure you. It was published in 1992, but it was mostly written by about 1982. And it was
Mm.
just very difficult to get published. It took a long time for me to find a publisher, and ultimately that was Columbia University Press. So I was quite lucky. And
Yeah.
from there, little by little, I broadened my writing field of interests because I was always interested in film, theater, uh, you know, and I kept writing basically criticism of one sort or the other.
I know you're based in New York City, so I'm just
Yes.
curious, have you been like a lifelong New York City resident, or like when did you move to New York City?
Oh, I didn't have to move to New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn, which, believe it or
Mm.
not, is part of New York City. And then I moved actually to the city, as everyone from the boroughs says, once I graduated once I graduated Cooper Union with my BFA. And so from really the early 1970s on, I've been living in Manhattan with rare episodes living outside of New York, but just for a few months at a time.
Mm. Yeah, that's funny about the boroughs and how they reference Manhattan because I'm on Long Island, originally from New Jersey, South Jersey, but I've been on Long Island for 9 years and I'm in Port Jefferson and they have a sign right in our downtown and you can see the Long Island Sound and it says New York 58 miles and it points left. And the first time I moved here, I thought, wait, isn't Long Island New York? But it is interesting how everyone references the city is New York
Yes.
um as Manhattan. But the reason I ask you about that and like knowing you're from Brooklyn, what neighborhood in Brooklyn are you from?
Generally speaking, I would say it's the Sheepshead Bay neighborhood, even though that was really only the subway stop I got off at. Then I had quite a walk to get home, but it wasn't an unusually long walk. But it was no longer Sheepshead Bay. I mean, where I lived was not exactly Sheepshead Bay, but generally speaking, I use that as the geographic location because more people know Sheepshead Bay than would know exactly where I lived.
Yeah, yeah. See, I was gonna pin you for living by Brooklyn College in Midwood.
Well, not very far off,
Ah,
and it was certainly it wasn't Midwood, but I was living in, I guess, technically what is thought of as Flatbush, but
okay.
but
Yeah,
but
yeah.
not
There's
Midwood.
just so many artists, like especially Jewish intellectuals from Midwood, from like the 50s, 60s, 70s. Arthur Miller, Bernie Sanders, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I could like go through the Rolodex.
If I'm
Um,
not mistaken, I think Arthur Miller actually went to the neighborhood high school that I would have gone to, Lincoln High School, Abraham Lincoln High School, except that I got to one of the specialized schools in New York, the High School of Music and Art.
oh, okay. Yeah, so growing up, I feel like now knowing you grew up in Brooklyn and then like now having lived in Manhattan for so many years, like with fellow travelers, do you feel like a certain um allegiance of sorts of like the way, I mean, they're in DC, but there is like a few scenes on Fire Island. So what was it like in the 1970s, the disco era into the 80s? Like, I mean, these are like two very important decades in fellow travelers, but also in your own life.
It's interesting though that Hawkins Fuller, the main character in Fellow Travelers, his parents live on the Upper East Side, which
Mm.
establishes him as coming from a sort of upper class, whereas Timothy Laughlin, his family comes from, I mean, his family lives in in Stuyvesant Town,
Mm.
although I think he was raised more in what would now be called sort of Hell's Kitchen or Clinton, which is a very Irish neighborhood, or used to be a very Irish neighborhood. So I felt a certain affinity just knowing that both of those characters had families who were from Manhattan, uh, and that was of great interest to me. And I knew quite specifically that if Tim Laughlin's family lived in Stuyvesant Town, well,
Hmm.
that also told me a lot about who his family was. Because most of the people who lived in Stuyvesant Town, which had been built by a life insurance company,
Yeah.
um, uh, were people who worked in the civil service in New York, mostly,
Mm.
not everyone. Anyway, it gave a sense of their their um, their economic, social, and economic backgrounds to know where their parents were living in Manhattan.
Yeah. Well, and like Thomas Mallon's novel, Fellow Travelers, and I know we're going to talk about like it comes out in 2007, and now we're in 2024. So, that's a significant uh time difference. What like do you find that the series that there was a disservice not to focus on New York City as much, except in like Fire Island and maybe passing references where this really is like a DC government based series?
Yeah, no, I didn't feel the lack of of that in the TV series. Um, New York, even in the novel, is referenced only really mostly because that's where each of their families lives, and there are a couple of scenes that take place in New York, but it's not a major element of the novel. And the novel, its great success, I think, because of Mallon's incredible research and his familiarity with DC, is that it really depicts life, political life, and social life in DC in the period of the Lavender Scare and the Red Scare, the McCarthy era.